Let's turn to the calculation of inflation rate. But before we do that, we need to talk about the price level. Simply because inflation rate is the percentage change in the price level. So we will first have to calculate the price level before we can calculate the inflation rate. The true level of prices of an economy is unknown because it is impossible to keep track of the change in prices of every single type of goods in this economy. So as a result, economists and statisticians construct some proxies to hopefully capture the true value of the price levels. So there are many types of proxies or price indexes that can be used to capture the true value of the price level. So one of the most commonly used, one of the most popular price indexes or proxy is called the Consumer Price Index, CPI. I'm sure some of you have seen that in the newspaper. It's a buzzword, CPI, CPI, CPI. It's a measure of changes in the average price of consumer goods and services from the base year. In this course, we are not going to calculate consumer price index. All we need to know is just, a rough idea of how this is constructed. So basically, consumer price index, as the name suggests, it is focused on consumer goods and services, food, transportations, educations, health insurance, and so on and so forth. So what economists and statisticians do is that they carry out a survey of a large sample of urban consumer households. So they will ask about what type of things they buy, what type of consumer goods and services they spend on. So food, clothing, the typical thing is food, clothing, entertainment, transportation, education, and so on and so forth. Okay? And so that's a consumer basket. That's a consumer or consumption bundle. Okay? Consumption bundle. And then the economists and statisticians try to find the weight of each item in the basket, how much they spend on food, how much of their income is spent on transportation, how much is spent on health insurance, and so on and so forth. Okay? So, and then the last thing is economists and statisticians will select a base year. So, but a base year serves as a benchmark. So all other periods will be compared to the base year. So one of the criteria of choosing a base year obviously is to find a year that is most representative of the recent years. So the year 2008, for example, is not going to be the base year because it's not appropriate. In 2008, we had a financial crisis, we had a recession. So that's not a normal year. That's not a representative year. So 2008, for example, is not going to be the base year. Okay. So once the base year is chosen, economists and statisticians tracked price changes of all these consumers and goods and services and in the basket, in the consumer basket of a typical urban household. So basically that's how that works. Okay. How to interpret CPI? We are not going to calculate CPI in this course. However, we want to know what that means. So if a friend of yours tells you that, well, the CPI in year 2011 was 226, we want to know what that means. I mean, 226 is just a number. What does that mean economically? So the base year was 1982. Let's say the base year was 1982. How do we interpret the CPI in year 2011? So what does that mean? So one thing that we can say upfront is the CPI of the base year is always 100 by design. So it is constructed that way so that it is easier to interpret, it is easy to read, it is easy to maneuver. So the CPI of the base year is always 100. So the same goes for other price indexes. It's either 100 or 1. Okay? So we are given that the CPI of the year 2011 was 226, so 226 minus the CPI of the base year, which is 100, always 100, and then divided by the starting point or the reference point, which is the price level of the base year. And then if you want it in percentage, multiply the whole thing by 100%, then you get 126%. So what that means is in 2011, the price level is 126% higher than the base year. So if you get 226, you know that in year 2011, the price level in general was 126% higher than the base year, whichever the base year was. Many of you will find that we don't even have to go through this calculation because the calculation can be quite simple. 226 minus 100, that's 126. Okay. So that's why the CPI of the base year is always 100. It makes the interpretation much easier. So with that, let's move on to inflation rate, the calculation of inflation rate. So inflation rate is simply the percentage change in the price level. So when you recall what you learned in math, in order to find a percentage change in a variable, so that's what we do. Okay? The price level of the later period minus the price level of the earlier period, and then divide the difference by the price level of the earlier period. Okay, so and then inflation rate is often expressed in percentage, so we multiply the whole thing by 100%. So let's look at an examples. Suppose the CPI of year 2010 was 200, while the CPI of year 1999 was 130. What is the inflation rate between 1999 and 2010? So why don't you spend about 5 minutes, no more than 5 minutes, to calculate the inflation rate? We'll take a pause here. So let's come back. Suppose the CPI of year 2010 was 200, while the CPI of year 1999 was 130. What is the inflation rate between 1999 and 2010? So it's the price level, the CPI of the later period, which is 2010, minus the CPI of the earlier period, which is 1999, and then divided by the CPI of the earlier period, 1999, and then multiply the whole thing by 100%. So we get 53.85%. Please note that this is different from the interpretation of CPI. When we try to interpret CPI, we use the CPI of the base year or the price level of the base year as the reference point. But when we calculate inflation rate, we use the price level of the earlier period as a reference point. Okay. So now let's turn to some applications of inflation rate or price indexes. So let's talk about real and nominal variables. Nominal variables are measured in current dollars. So if we're talking about a certain amount of money in 2017, then it is measured using the price level of 2017. Okay? Real variables, however, are measured in constant dollar or constant prices. So that means we have a base year and we have a benchmark, and we treat the price level constant at that benchmark level or the base year level. So what that means is when we calculate or measure real variables, we take away the effect of inflation. So if you have a nominal variable, by the way, is what we usually observe, we usually run into in our daily life. So when we have a nominal variable and we want to convert it into a real variable, we would take the nominal variable and divide it by the price index, and then normalize it. Normalize means you want to make it easier to interpret, easier to maneuver. So you normalize it by multiplying by 100. So that's how we get the real variable. Okay, so take for example, if you have a certain amount of nominal income in year 2000 and you want to convert that into the real income of year 2000, so you take the nominal income of year 2000 divided by the price index of year 2000. Okay, so price index, it doesn't necessarily have to be CPI. It can be any other price indexes that you think is appropriate. So multiply the whole thing by 100. Okay, so that's how we convert it into the real income of year 2000. So let's look at an example. So suppose the nominal income of year 2000 is $3,000 and the price index of year 2000 is 150. What is the real income of year 2000? So let's spend a few minutes on this one, no more than 5 minutes. We'll take a pause here. It would be useful if you pause your video so that you can work on the calculation. So we'll come back. So, but we are simply plugging in the numbers now. So in order to find the real income of year 2000, all we need to do is to take the nominal income of year 2000 divided by the price index of year 2000 and multiply the whole thing by 100. That's how we get $2,000. Okay, so the real income of year 2000 is $2,000. Okay? What that means is if there is no inflation If there is no inflation, then a person who makes $2,000 is as well off as a person who makes $3,000 with inflation. So here, let's take a look at another pair of real and nominal output. Real and nominal variables. So we are looking at real and nominal output, or GDP, okay, which is measured by GDP. So it's pretty much the same formula. Real output is equal to nominal output divided by the price index, and then multiply the whole thing by 100 if we want to normalize it. Okay? So we'll look at an example here. Suppose the nominal output this year is 1,000 billion, while the current price level is measured at 120. What is the real output this year? Okay. Once again, let's take a pause. So why don't you pause the video clip so that you can work on this calculation a little bit. So let's pause for about 3 minutes. So let's come back to this. We would take the nominal income, a nominal output of this year, divided by the price index, the price level of this year, 120, and then multiply the whole thing by 100. That's how we get the real output. Real output or real GDP is a very important indicator, more so than the nominal output to policymakers. Policymakers tend to put more weight on real output than nominal output. When you read newspapers, a lot of times when GDP or output of data is released by the government agency, more than likely the figure that is released to the public is actually real output, not nominal output. The reason being, policymakers think that real output is probably a better indicator of how well the economy is doing, or how much the economy is producing or consuming. And so let's consider let's consider an example. Let's assume that last year was the base year. Okay, so last year was the base year. So let's assume that last year the real output and the nominal output are $800 billion. Okay. So in the base year, there is no inflation, so the real output and the nominal output are the same thing. Okay? So let's say $800 billion last year, base year. Okay? So this year, when you look at the nominal output is $1,000 billion, then you would say that, wow, our economy has grown a lot, right? From last year to this year, $800 billion to $1,000 billion, that's a lot. But when you think about it, nominal output is simply the product of the price and the quantity of goods and services that is produced. Okay? So when we go from $800 billion to $1,000 billion, we don't know how much. It's because of an increase in the productions of goods and services. Okay? And we don't know how much is because of an increase in the price level. I mean, if a lot of it is because of the former, if it's because we have a sharp increase in the production of goods and services, that's good news. But if a lot of it is because of the latter, if it's because of an increase, a sharp increase in the price of goods and services, then that's bad news. So while nominal output or nominal GDP is very easy to calculate, it sometimes may not be a good indicator for policymaking. But when you look at real output, so we have calculated it is 833 billion. So it is a much more modest growth compared to the base year or last year. Okay? That's because we have taken away the effect of inflation. Okay? We have taken away the change in prices. So now we can focus on the variable itself, which is the output or the GDP. Okay? So while we are talking about real output and nominal output, I would like to introduce ourselves to an additional price index. So previously we talked about CPI, which is the commonly used price indexes. So now let's look at another one, GDP deflator. Okay. So GDP deflator is simply the nominal GDP divided by the real GDP, okay, and then take the whole thing, multiply it by 100. Okay. By the way, it's not 100% because this is an index, so there is no unit. Okay. I am not going to go into the math, but some of you may notice that this formula is actually very much the same as this one with some rearrangements of terms. Okay? So if you want to, you can try to manipulate this equation to see whether you are able to convert it into this one. Okay, so in this case, the price index is simply GDP deflator. Okay, so you can convert it into this one. So instead of two formulas, it's actually just one formula. Okay. So now let's do a little bit of calculation. Suppose the nominal GDP is 1,000, while the real GDP is 833. What is a GDP deflator? So let's take a pause. So why don't you pause your video clip for a few minutes and work on your calculation. We'll come back to this. Okay, we'll come back and it's a nominal GDP divided by the real GDP, and then multiply the whole thing by 100, simply to make it easier to read, easier to manipulate, and we get 120. So the price index, which is GDP deflator, in this case, that's 120. Okay. The last pair of real and nominal interest rate we introduce ourselves to is the last pair of real and nominal variables that we will introduce ourselves to is real and nominal interest rate. So real interest rate is equal to nominal interest rate minus inflation rate. Strictly speaking, it should be expected inflation rate because it's the inflation rate that takes place in the future. But for our classroom setting, it suffices to say inflation rate. Okay? So in our daily life, when we make financial investment, the return or the interest rate that we get is almost always expressed in nominal terms. So take, for example, if you have a saving account, every month you get a monthly statement from your bank, and on that statement you're likely to see your interest rate, and that interest rate is in nominal terms. That means it has not taken into consideration inflation rate. So let's look at your saving account these days. So your saving account is what? Let's say you're luckiest person in the world. I mean, your saving account offers you 1% interest rate. I say you're luckiest person in the world is because we don't get we don't even get 0.5% interest rate from our saving account these days. Okay? So let's say you get 1% interest rate from your saving account. Okay, so in a world without inflation, your purchasing power will increase by 1% next year. Okay, when you get back your interest rate. Okay, when you get back your interest payment. But the thing is, that's not the case in real world because we live in a world with inflation. So let's say the inflation rate is 2%. Okay? So if you get a 1% interest rate from your saving account, next year when you get back your money, you actually are worse off in terms of purchasing power. You get to buy 1% less goods and services. Okay? So that's why many people, I mean, in the past 10 years or so, many people argue that, well, there is no point putting money in your saving account because you're not growing money on money. In fact, you're losing money every day because of inflation. But obviously, many of us still put our money in a saving account for other reasons. Yeah, because, I mean, it is still safest, right? In the sense that, yes, we will lose our purchasing power, but if you have $1,000 in the bank today, next year you're still going to have $1,000, okay, in the bank. But if you put it in the stock market, for example, okay, put $1,000 in the stock market today, next year, you may have more than $1,000, but you can also lose everything. Okay? So the risk is much higher in many other financial instruments. So that's why, I mean, even though we lose purchasing power with a very low nominal interest rate these days, but a lot of us will still put some money in the saving account. Okay? So let's look at the last exercise before we turn to another topic. Jane makes a loan at 3% interest rates. The inflation rate is 2%. What is the real interest rate? So the answer is 1%. So Jane is better off by 1%. She can buy 1% more goods and services next year. Okay?